Hello everyone. It's again a pleasure to have this lecture with you all. So if you have been following up with the administration of Christian education material that we've been doing, I've been trying to talk about the different issues in leadership and what are the main issues that are involved in leadership, and especially when it comes to Christian education. Now, I know I've not been discussing a lot about Christian education. I'll be coming back into that in the next 3 or 4 sessions, but mainly I've been trying to talk about what are the main skills that we need to know as leaders, and especially as Christian leaders. So we try to discuss the idea of New Testament idea of leadership and African-based leadership and understanding of leadership from an African perspective. And today, yesterday, I have uploaded a material called Christian conflict resolution, which I would like to start discussing, because when we start thinking about leadership, one of the main issues that we always find when it comes to leadership are mistakes and conflicts. There's no denial that within the Christian circle, we are continually engaging in conflict and in mistakes. So as leaders, what are the few elements that we need to know and clearly understand when it comes to leadership and conflict management? So the first issue I would like for each of us to see is the different principles that we have in leadership. So one of the main issues that we have when it comes to leadership and conflict management is leaders' characters in order not to understand how to deal with conflict and how to manage conflict. So if you are considering what should leaders really consider when it comes to conflict, the first one is that most leaders have a lack of humility. So power and authority has a thing of getting into your head. When you have power, when you have authority, when you're seated in a particular position, you feel like people should listen to you and people should accept whatever you're saying. And that's very wrong. Leaders should clearly and consciously understand that failure is part of leadership. And we need to understand that we as leaders are not perfect. We're not God, we're humans. And we ought to make mistakes and we will make mistakes. So we need to understand that leaders need to have humility. And leaders need to learn from their mistakes. We cannot assume ourselves to be perfect in everything. And another major problem that many leaders do is they try to avoid conflict. Now, good leaders and good team managers do know that conflict is the heartbeat of any relationship. Many people say if you are in a relationship of any kind, it could be a familial relationship, a romantic relationship, a work relationship, or a leader follower relationship. In any of those relationships, if conflict is not occurring, then there is a certain level of lacking in transparency and honesty between the two elements that are engaged in the leadership. Basically, ግጭት የሌለበት ግንኙነት እውነተኛ የሌለበት ግንኙነት ነው። ሰዎች በግንኙነታቸው መካከል ግጭትን የማይፈጥሩ ከሆነ እያተጋጩ ካልሆነ እየተፋተጉ ካልሆነ then there is a problem. Disagreement and difficulties are completely normal. But if leaders are continually avoiding them, then they are avoiding them at the cost of proper leadership and proper management. Look at the third bulletin. But when performance or personality issues go unaddressed, they fester and set an overall tone that minimizes the urgency of correcting mistakes. If there is an issue, it's best to address it right away when the situation is fresh. Do not avoid conflict. Do not say, okay, or the great leaders understand how to fairly address problems on their team. Great leaders essentially have a good characteristic of not avoiding conflict, but facing conflict and giving it resolutions. Another problem that many leaders have when it comes to understanding and how to solve leadership problems is not properly setting boundaries. Now, leaders need to have good emotional intelligence. Now, I will upload a link here about emotional intelligence and how you can learn about emotional intelligence. But a lack of good emotional intelligence, a lack of understanding how people feel, a lack of setting boundaries between ourselves and our followers will create a problem among us ourselves. So an effective leader has the emotional intelligence to successfully toe the line between being friendly and being assertive. We don't want our followers to walk all over us. Push over. We cannot be people that cannot be faced with. If we have a good positive relationship, then good and positive relationship is all about boundaries. Boundaries is a very important element. ወላጅነትን ስናነሳ ስለ boundary እናነሳለን። አገልግሎትን ስናነሳ boundary እናነሳለን። ስለዚህ there is no point leadershipን ስናነሳ boundary ላናነሳበት የምንችልበት ምክንያት. People need to set excellent boundaries. Leaders need to understand where good boundary is between good friendliness and good assertiveness. And the next one is the lack of follower feedback. if we don't understand what our people are feeling about ourselves, if we don't clearly understand, and if we're just spranging through our leadership, okay, how are we doing? Is there effectiveness and efficiency? Let us just stop here and assess our work, then we will be failing in our leadership. And that's a very, very important element. So every leader needs to set clear goals and provide frequent follower feedback or employee feedback. We need to give them feedback, and we need to understand. We need to stop at some point and ask, how are we doing? We need to stop at some point and say, are we working properly? And then another element is undefined vision and goal. Leadership is all about goal. የመጀመሪያው ሁለተኛው ሴሽን ላይ quality of leadership ስንመለከት አንደኛው quality, it is goal oriented or purpose driven ብለናል. If we don't have a clear understanding of what our purpose is, if we don't have a clearly written vision, mission and goal where leadership is thriving at, then we will not very well be successful. And another one is position seeking. We cannot remember amongst characteristics of biblical leadership ስናነሳ situational leadership ያለው ነገር ነበር. No human being is a leader all the time at a particular place for a particular position. Leadership is very situational. የሆነ ጊዜ ላይ የሆነ ቦታ ላይ ለሆነ ጊዜ ሊደር ነን፣ ከዛ በኋላ ደግሞ ያንን አብዲኬት አድርገን መሄድ አለብን። or ደግሞ ዴሊጌት ማድረግ መቻል አለብን። If we assume we can take the role of everything, አስተማሪ መጋቢም የልጆቹ ማስተማሪ የቤተክርስቲያኒቱንም የሆነ ነገር መሆን የምንችል ከመሰለን, if we feel like we can take over every area of life, then we will have a problem. It would be just position seeking. So delegation marks true leadership. We need to trust the people that are our followers, and we need to make leadership possible for those people. If we're doing that, if we're capable of giving back the leadership position, then we will clearly understand a good way of how to handle conflict. So how do we handle conflict? The first element should be understanding the inevitability of conflict. Conflict is inevitable. One of the first elements we need to understand in this is here. Now, I like this sentence and I would like to read it. Our knowledge is incomplete and imperfect. So even sinless people in a perfect world will see the same situation differently through their own knowledge and their own perspective. Even if we live in this hypothetical environment where we're sinless human beings, we're still short. We're not God. We don't have perfect knowledge. We don't have perfect understanding. We don't have a 360 vision. We just have this vision that's 2020 that sees in its own boundaries. So the first element we need to understand is we don't all look at things in the same manner. We need to be very clear about our understanding. The second one is we live in a fallen world. Sinlessness is not our life. We are very much part of a sinful world where sanctification is a process. እያንዳንዳችን የምንኖረው ክርስቶስን ወደ መምሰል ነው እንጂ ክርስቶስን መስለን አይደለም። እያንዳንዳችን የሳንቲፊኬሽን ፕሮሰስ ላይ ነን ያለነው። Conflict is part of sanctification. When our sinful nature wants to get its own, and when our Christ imitating nature wants his own, conflict happens even within ourselves. And conflict happens within the fallen world because that is the nature of the fallen world. And another one is we have an enemy that's continually engineering conflict to happen. So as much as possible, our enemy, Satan, is setting us into conflict with ourselves, with God, and with others. So we need to clearly understand that. And the last one is we knowingly enter into and initiate conflict with evil whenever we proclaim the gospel. So as people who are proclaiming the gospel of Christ, as people who are living, አንደኛ ጴጥሮስ ምዕራፍ 2 ቁጥር 8 እና 9 እንደዛ ነው አይደለም የሚለው እግዚአብሔር በአስደናቂ ምህረቱ ጠርቶን ቤተሰብ ያልነበርነው ቤተሰብ ሲያደርገን የርስቱ የመንግስቱ ወራሾች የእርሱ ህዝብ ሲያደርገን ቁጥር 12 ላይ ወረድ ይልና it says እንግዲህ እንግዶችና መጻተኞች እንደመሆናችሁ ይላል ማለት ነው. So this is not our world. This is a world where we live as visitors, sojourners. So we're continually fighting ከዚህ ዓለም ገዢ ከሆነው ሰይጣን ጋር. So አንድ አይነት ፐርስፔክቲቭ የለንም። የሰው ሁሉ መንገድ ፐርፌክት የሆነ ኖሌጅ ስለሌለን በወደቀ ዓለም ላይ ስለምንኖር ጠላት ስላለን ከዛኛ ራሳችን ደግሞ የዚች ምድር አለቃ የማይወደውን መልእክት ይዘን ስለምንመጣ በኑሯችን ውስጥ ኮንፍሊክት ኢኔቪታብል ነው. We cannot live without conflict. The issue should be how do we as Christians handle conflict? Now, this is the normal conflict handling model. So we have concern for ourselves and concern for others አለ so the concern for ourselves እና concern for our others በጣም low ሲሆን we avoid conflict ለራሳችንም አንጠነቀቅ ለሌሎችም አንጠነቀቅ ከሆነ we avoid conflict if we have high concern for others but low concern for ourselves ለራሳችን ብዙ ማናስብ የሰዎች ነገር በጣም የሚያስጨንቀን ከሆነ we become accommodating when conflict comes በቃ ሻንተ ትክክል ያልከው ይሁን በቃ እኔ ተሳስቼ ነበር እንላለን or when we have high concern just for ourselves and low concern for others we are continually competing because we're competing and we're fighting and we're in a trouble to get what's good for ourselves but when we have high concern for ourselves and high concern for others we become collaborative people we collaborate with people in order to support each other. However, a balance of concern for others and concern for ourselves gives us compromise. So we compromise. However, this is not very biblical because it misses one of the most important elements that is true to the world. That is the will of God and who God is in our life. If you look at the Bible puts the great commandment as love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and then love your neighbor as you love yourself. So when you think of conflict resolution as a Christian, we cannot think of it as the most important thing that should come is what do we think of God, what do we think of ourselves, and what do we think of our neighbor. And our assumption or what we think about God should always come first. So we need to understand that there is a conflict between us and God. There's a conflict between us and our neighbor. And there is a conflict between us, our neighbor, and God. But this has been solved by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But because our salvation is already but not yet, we need to be very conscious on how we deal with our conflicts. So we have our goals and we have a goal to our neighbors. So it's not about what's good for me, but it's about, is my goal in accordance to God's will? Or is my goal not in accordance to God's will? Or is my neighbor's goal in accordance to God's will? Or is my neighbor's goal not in accordance to God's will? So when both our and our neighbor's goal are not in accordance to our God's will, we need to avoid that thing. የኛም የወንድማችን የባልንጀራችንም ሐሳብ ከእግዚአብሔር ሐሳብ ጋር የማይገጥም ከሆነ then we should avoid the issue. We should not go into conflict. የባልንጀራችን ሐሳብ ግን የእግዚአብሔርን ፈቃድ የሚፈጽመው ነው የኛ ካልሆነ we should be accommodating. And then if our will is of God's will and not of our neighbor, then we should be competing to fulfill the will of God. And then at the end of the day, we collaborate and accommodate if both our neighbors and God's will, our own will is according to God's will. So the most important element within the Christian circle should not be what's my goal. Conflict in the Christian leaders, we should not start asking ourselves, okay, the first question should be, is it God's will? And our conflict ውስጥ ያለነው ሰዎች ግጭት ውስጥ ያሉት ሰዎች ራሳቸው በእግዚአብሔር ፈቃድ ውስጥ የተቀመጡ ሰዎች ናቸው ወይ ብለን ነው መጠየቅ ያለብን. So I have an assignment for you this week. I'll give you a case study, and based on that case study, I would like your recommendations on how you as a Christian leader could work toward this conflict resolution. I do hope this was helpful, and I will try to engage in the discussion board too. Thank you very much.